But if you really were to look at your life, what you're really doing is trying to live a form of Nietzschean self-creation. And I think if you look at public discourse today and the whole rise of the woke, it really is a celebration of the disembodied will where the person creates themselves. Uh, and he says, that's all, that's one option, or you can uh, uh, undertake once again the quest.
So, welcome everybody to another episode of Angelicum Conversations, a new interview series of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, better known as the Angelicum, here in Rome, where we explore theology, philosophy, and culture in conversation with leading scholars from around the world. Our guest today is Father Michael Sherwin, an esteemed professor of moral and spiritual theology here at the Angelicum. Father Michael is originally from California. He has studied and taught theology for many years at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland before coming to Rome. He is a great jazz aficionado, among other things. However, today we will not be talking so much about jazz, but more about Friedrich Nietzsche, and specifically about a lecture that Father Michael recently gave in the U.S. entitled Christian Virtue in America's Nietzschean Wasteland, Thomistic Reflections. Father Michael, thank you for joining us here
Thank you.
today. So I'm going to start with some stage setting by asking about Friedrich Nietzsche. You speak about a contemporary Nietzschean wasteland, but even before getting directly to what that implies about Nietzsche, let's just start with the imagery of the wasteland. Is this primarily a moral, spiritual, cultural, philosophical diagnosis? What does the metaphor of wasteland mean for you?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, the quote comes from one of the characters in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And he says, let's see, I got the quote here: "The wasteland grows. Woe to him who harbors wastelands within." Now, in the English language, wasteland, either as two words or one word, has a long history. It's used in the scriptures to be both a place of trial, but also a place of grace. And the desert fathers went out to the wasteland to wrestle with the demons and their own imperfections, but it became a place of encountering the stillness of God. So it has a two-edged side to it. There's uh, it's a place where you can diagnose one's own spiritual need and poverty, but it's also where a person can encounter grace. Now, in Western literature, you go back to the 1920s and you've got T.S. Eliot, and he was very clear. He wanted it to be two words, the wasteland. And it starts by giving a kind of negative retelling of the Canterbury Tales. All you have to do is read the first paragraph of the Canterbury Tales and see that the beginning of the wasteland, the Canterbury Tales is celebrating the beginning of spring and where there's new life sprouting from the roots and everything is renewed. And yet Eliot says it's the cruelest. Instead of being a sign of hope, April is the cruelest month because it gives you hope for new life, and yet in fact, your deepest desires are dashed. And I think he articulates the experience of the 20th century generation that lived through the killing fields of the First World War. And American literature and British literature is really a reflection on the loss of faith and yet the desire for the adventure. If you look at Hemingway or Steinbeck, and even back earlier, if you look at someone who's a contemporary of Nietzsche, and who read Nietzsche, Sam Clemens, Mark Twain is enthralled with the beauty and goodness of the Christian adventure, of the civil the the knights and the chivalry of knights and the journey and the quest. He wants all of that. But how do you preserve the beauty of the Christian vision when you no longer believe in the God of Revelation because of your experience of innocent suffering? And that's really a theme throughout, starting with Eliot's Wasteland, but it repeats. And you can look at, I think, the great Steinbeck's great masterpiece is The Grapes of Wrath, where you have the preacher who no longer he believes in beautiful things, but he no longer believes in the God of revelation. And uh, The Sun Also Rises with Hemingway, you have that great expression by Brett. The only thing that remains to us is not to be a bitch, she says. That is, they want to do what the Greeks would call the beautiful deed, the kalos. But is that enough? At the end of the day, uh, it doesn't leave much hope.
This is a perfect segue to then talk about Nietzsche. I mean, in some ways, the way I understand him, at least, um, Nietzsche is worried about staving off the threat of nihilism in the wake of the collapse of Christianity as a no longer, or maybe never, in fact, credible project. So the veil of illusion about the Judeo-Christian narrative of meaning has been torn from, the veil has been torn, and now we see the threat of a radical underlying nihilism. But when you say Nietzschean wasteland, I mean,
Yeah.
the wasteland is a kind of post-Nietzschean. If we have a Nietzschean diagnosis, is that because we think that there's basically a kind of shred of truth to Christianity's demise, as he diagnoses it, or is it because we think his idea about the threat of nihilism is insightful, or is it because actually, despite his protests, Nietzsche does lead us towards a kind of post-Christian nihilism? How are you thinking about the Nietzschean dimension of the wasteland?
Yeah, so referring back to the lecture I gave, um, there is a MacIntyrean subtext. So Alasdair MacIntyre, about a year ago, uh, over a year ago now, retired from public life. He stopped writing, and I started to think about his legacy and his influence. And he uh, he basically says that the two options are either Nietzsche or rediscovering the quest. And he's not alone in that. Uh, but let's go back to Nietzsche. His last great work is The Twilight of the Idols, where he summarizes first of all, it was an incredible achievement. He had been sick. He was staying at Sils Maria, this beautiful lake resort in Switzerland, and he had a period of rare period of health, and then in about a week he wrote this work that summarizes his vision, and he he summarizes his attack on basically the comfortable German middle class, but he focuses on how this is instantiated among the English and about how the English think they can get rid of the God of Christianity and still maintain the morality of Christianity. Now, again, this is a strategic thing. He's actually speaking to the German middle class, but he is articulating something that people like Sam Clemens at exactly the same time, and Nietzsche admired what Mark Twain was writing at that time. They identify that there's a falsity in attempting to preserve the old morality when you no longer believe in the God of Revelation. And so when you look at MacIntyre in his last great book, which is Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, he basically tries to write a book for the ordinary person's perspective. Now, of course, MacIntyre is very generous in what he thinks an ordinary person can follow in reading MacIntyre's works, but he presents it as saying, look, you're a kind of a motivist, although he has a different terminology for this. You but if you really were to look at your life, what you're really doing is trying to live a form of Nietzschean self-creation. And I think if you look at public discourse today and the whole rise of woke, it really is a celebration of the disembodied will where the person creates themselves. Uh, and he says, that's one option, or you can undertake once again the quest.
So, okay, interesting. So you're taking the idea of a self-created morality and the illusions that come with it of, let's call it a genealogy of morals and a genealogy of victors and losers and of future rights-oriented consciousness versus people who live in a past that's transcended in woke culture to be a kind of, in some way, still deluded enterprise of the kind Nietzsche would have questioned. It does seem to me, and I'm not an expert on it, but I have worked on his writing a fair amount, that Nietzsche's idea of I the notion that one can construct a morality that is kind of a universal and objective applicable to all is problematic. There's a kind of artistic liberty underlying every act of so-called moral presumption. And so there's a kind of will to power because there's always this creative, generative dimension. That's really what we are. We're artists. We're not really ethical ethicists. I mean, so it
Well, I
seems,
mean,
yeah, no,
the way in which MacIntyre uses Nietzsche is influenced by Miss Anscombe, because Elizabeth Anscombe also articulates a similar critique
about
of
English morality.
about English morality.
Yeah.
And the key here you have to go back to the systematic doubt of Descartes. The attempt of the Enlightenment to create a morality that was analogous to the the emerging power of the natural sciences, and that was not dependent upon a concrete historical community. I mean, put yourself. I think it's important for us imaginatively to put ourselves into Descartes' situation. He witnesses one of the most famous battles in the wars of religion. And the wars of religion, what do you have? You have a French prince, the Cardinal Richelieu, making an alliance with a Protestant king, the King of Sweden, to attack a Catholic emperor. And all of this in the name of religious orthodoxy. So you have a generation that's begun to really doubt that if Christian morality is true, it can't be dependent upon how we've been formed by a concrete community. So their ideal is they're going to it's going to be dependent upon a form of rational analysis that seems to have the same power that the natural sciences now have with the using of the reductionist method of mathematical inquiry. So they try to do the same. And Nietzsche points out that it's a fool's errand. You can't ground morality except, as MacIntyre would say, by being initiated into the life and practices of a community.
But do you think Nietzsche has a morality? I mean, aside from the
Yeah, so
question,
he thinks that the only thing that's you have to then swallow hard and realize that you're the creator. Your nobility comes from being the creator of your own morality. You become the Superman, the Ubermensch. You have to really own that and own the fact that you create your own
yeah,
morality.
so that seems to be a lot more radical than the idea that we suddenly discover new rights that were latent that we haven't yet been able to evince. It seems like he's just saying that morality is really, in a certain way,
Yeah,
an
we
act of
we are like
artistic
little
creativity.
gods.
Yeah.
And of course, the other option is to rediscover the humble path that you can't get out from under the fact that even your interiority, this is where another German speaker, the Austrian Ludwig Wittgenstein, becomes important because his argument in the philosophical investigations against private language, once you see the force of his argument, you realize that Descartes' systematic doubt doesn't work. When Descartes says he's found something he can't doubt, that he thinks, cogito ergo sum, Descartes' response is simply, well, what's cogito? That's a Latin word. Your own interiority comes from you're able to have an interior life because you've been initiated into the language and practices of a concrete community. And
Yeah. So, there's a famous line in the Archaeology of Knowledge of Foucault where he says, paraphrasing, don't think you're going to get rid of God and then you're going to keep the self
yeah,
as this narrative entity that's going to underlie all of your moral heroicism. So okay, so we've gotten towards this idea of a quest setting out back toward a classical tradition, try to think about foundations for an authentic human flourishing. And then you've got some protagonists who you think are especially important. You've mentioned one of them, MacIntyre. You've mentioned another, which is Elizabeth Anscombe. So let's talk about Anscombe's assist. Like Nietzsche, she thought that a lot of contemporary British morality is not thought out to its, you might say, metaphysical foundations, or is set on arbitrary terms, and she wanted to challenge the consensus of moral thinking in the 1950s and 60s. And she wrote a famous essay. And can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, so I would back up a little bit. Um, the apotheosis of the old Enlightenment vision, but in an embodied way, was probably the end of the 19th century. If you look at the way in which Oxford, for example, you study the classics in order to serve the country and to serve the empire. And so you had this amazing period where you had people in London going back to talk to their tutors and professors at Oxford about concrete problems and looking back on Greek and Roman history to help them solve problems. So it was the apotheosis of this vision that, as Kipling will say, the God of the way things should be was reigning comfortably. And you have the emergence after the uh, First World War of a different philosophy that is the philosophical, ethical equivalent of the rise of art for art's sake. So they don't think that their ethics is useful in any way. It's their own creation, and those analytic philosophers that begin to start doing ethics. And uh, Collingwood, at the end of his autobiography, which he publishes in 1939, says, what is going to be the offspring of this ethical nihilism is going to be, and is already, we can already see it in Germany and Italy. It's a generation that thinks the only truth is power, and that the moralists of Oxford and Cambridge are, and elsewhere in Europe, are going to have a very, very high debt to pay for the generation they've created. And the Miss Anscombe was studying at Oxford at St. Hugh's. She won a scholarship there. She had quite a remarkable background. And there were also other women who were able to study at Oxford at Somerville who were all influenced by Collingwood on this point, and they actually believed what they shared in common, and there have been some recent studies on it. The Women Are Up to Something by Benjamin Lipscomb is a great example of that study of what they did. They believe that there is right, there is wrong, and you can tell the difference. And they started to study, well, what are the foundations of this? And what really got Miss Anscombe going was after the war, and the way in which the West had corrupted its own values to win the war through the aerial bombing of civilian populations.
We're on the Second World War now.
Second World
Yeah.
War, yes. I'm sorry for the generation as old as me. Our parents were in the war, and it's the Second World War. Um, but Miss Anscombe tried to start a petition against Harry Truman receiving an honorary doctorate at Oxford because of his role in approving the atomic bomb. And she didn't get much support for it, which shocked her. Then Philippa Foot, her colleague, was going off to do research in Canada and asked her to take over teaching a seminar in ethics. And Miss Anscombe discovered, trying to read the manuals to prepare for this course, that the same reasoning that led people to drop bombs on the innocent were contained in these manuals of ethics. And what she really puts her finger on in her famous essay in 1958 in the journal Philosophy, entitled Modern Moral Philosophy, she puts her finger on the fact that both sides in the debates uh, over whether the foundation of ethics is in utility or in formal rules share a false understanding of obligation that is a vestige of Christian culture and is not philosophically grounded. And she,
Wait, hold on. We got to unpack that.
yeah,
Utility. That's doing things that are going to basically try to remove pain and augment pleasure and usefulness. And
yes. I
with
mean,
obligation, it's just basically what you can't do, as
yeah.
so
So,
that we can all get
so
along
for
with each other.
utility, Bentham and Mill had, the greatest good for the greatest number. But the problem becomes, in a concrete case, how do you discern whether you should or shouldn't do this action? is it simply justified through a kind of calculus of the positive outcomes? And she noticed that in British society, it's kind of a rule utilitarianism. And she invented a word for this, which is consequentialism. She's the one who coined that word to a kind of rule utilitarianism. But it's basically a calculus of the positive outcome and that you can do it if there's a more positive outcomes than others. And of course, there are a lot of concrete cases where they try to probe whether this really works. And the famous trolley car case is an example of this. But nonetheless, that's one side of the debate. The other side says, no, that would authorize you to do lots of terrible things. And morality is really based on obedience to formal rules, which is a heritage of Kant, because Kant saw the earlier form of this utilitarianism in a form of Humean emotivism, and he felt that the only way to stop us all just doing what we desire to do is through some type of allegiance to formal rule
and therefore
that
and
is
and
not
that
motivated.
and that involves absolute prohibitions, which we Thomists are not against, but we just don't think that that's enough for morality.
Yeah.
Now,
But she argues that they both share a false understanding of both human nature and of where obligation. What is the source of obligation? And she asks the meta question: why am I obliged to do the greatest good for the greatest number? Or why am I obliged to act according to formal, impersonal formal rules? And if you permit me, I think an example that is illustrative of this is Philip Haley wrote a book. Philip Haley was a longtime professor. I think he was at Wesleyan. Anyway, he wrote a book on evil, and it got him depressed. So he thought he would write studies on people who did remarkably courageous things, like save people in shipwrecks and all the. And as he was doing his research, someone said, "You should look at the French village of Le Chambon, where the women of the village and the pastor, all the men were out working they'd all been sent to labor camps, but the pastor and the women of this Huguenot village, Protestant village in the south of France, they saved 6,000 Jewish children." So Haley arrives there with all these Kantian notions of formal rules and all that. And the pastor's wife says to him, so at this time, the women of the village are now in their 60s and 70s. And she says, "You don't understand anything. It was about the children." Now, what Miss Anscombe pointed out is that neither consequentialism nor this deontology or this Kantian formal rules, it's never about the children. The children disappear. There are no qualitative aspects of the analysis. So she argued we need to return to what people have rephrased as being an adequate anthropology. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to thrive? And to see that the principles of ethical analysis are presupposed in our own humanity. And that's, again, the quest to rediscover those.
so here I would transition in my language to the positive solution of Thomism being about human natural inclination to the good and human flourishing, and the development of virtues so that we can cultivate a life of human flourishing in accord with our best human
And we
inclinations.
can stick with English literature. So Shakespeare in As You Like It, for example, whenever people in Shakespeare, any of his characters, are confused about who they are, he sends them out into the green of the forest to rediscover simple truths. So when the court jester bumps into Corwin the shepherd out in the forest of Arden, he says, "I want to see if there's any philosophy in him." And it's a comic exchange because Corwin the shepherd says, "Well, I know that the principal cause of darkness is the lack of the sun," and he goes through truisms. Now, uh, Orwell saw the importance of what Shakespeare was doing, and in a key passage in 1984, he has Winston Smith say, "Truisms are true. Hold on to that. Water is wet, stones are hard, fire burns." And freedom is the freedom to affirm the truth that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So it's rediscovering and being faithful to these simple truths that you rediscover the quest. And in contemporary literature, someone who continues uh, the reflections in the Wasteland, and of course, Eliot's Wasteland ends in hope. It ends with the troubadour from the French troubadour that Dante puts in to his journey, that has a hope about there are still vestiges of the image to be found. And Cormac McCarthy, the most recent, I think, reflection on Eliot's Wasteland is in The Road, which he begins with a description of the post-nuclear war world as a wasteland, and he has images that are drawn right from Eliot's poem. But it ends with what? It ends with a small community of people renewing a
And it's all about
culture.
trying to save a child, right? The boy. So
A
the
father
you know
trying to save his son, and he saves the son long enough for the son to reconnect
with a
with a
community,
community that is
right?
on the road.
But now, when you say a community, I don't think you mean, to take us back to Nietzsche's constructivism, just the individual will to art or will to power or creative construction. You shall be as gods. Now, writ large for the constructivist purposes of a collective who decide they will create their own morality and everything's relative to a certain community. I think what you're saying is it's of the natural law that we can only discover our best human inclinations and human flourishing when we're actually committed. But that suggests, right, that in a way it's part of our nature, at least our fallen nature, that we can sort of segregate into individualism and autonomy and not develop the virtues through mutual dependence. But actually, that's not good for us. It's by committing to a polity, it's by being part of a community, it's by living something real in justice, friendship, charity, and religion with other people, we sort of discover the deeper
Well, we
dimensions of our
rediscover
nature.
in community, we rediscover the quest. Nature alone isn't sufficient. That's the tragedy that we all sooner or later discover. But it also, the wasteland also points to that still, quiet voice. The natural world is still the playground where grace and the spirit love to dwell. So it's by returning to the community's quest for fulfillment that the Lord is able to speak to us, where it become and so in the wasteland is it within us. So there's that woe that Nietzsche says, but there's also, and this is what Nietzsche doesn't have, there's also hope, because in the wasteland you can rediscover the voice of God.
Tell me if I'm re-articulating this in another way. When I read Aquinas on nature and grace, human nature and divine grace, he says that even after the fall, or despite the effects of our collective fall into sin as a human race, we retain natural inclinations to the good. However, we also have contrary inclinations, and especially acute in Aquinas is the natural love of God. Like, we're really not able to fulfill ourselves ultimately by loving something less than God, but we aren't able in our fallen state to effectively love God. And so, really, only with grace is there some kind of resolution by which inwardly we now can begin to love God freely at this higher level by supernatural charity that's going to allow us to get back in touch with our deepest natural impulses and capacities and liberate us from just settling for some good that isn't God, that's secondary. So we're kind of in tension between good inclinations and contrary inclinations. Grace kind of unlocks us to settle on what's greatest. And that means also effectively knowing our own limitations and sins, honestly, in light of our failures. And then we can kind of put things in order and begin to live with other people in a better and deeper way.
Well, the challenge is that, and this is the anti-Nietzschean part of the quest, is living according to nature facilitates the Lord's call to us in grace. Uh, we're not Cartesian selves. Uh, it is by having well-ordered passions, or striving to well-order them in community. It's by being in apprenticeship to the activities of the community that the heart is prepared to hear the voice of conscience within us and the voice of God and to respond to grace. So that nature, grace is nothing without nature. Grace is the effect of God's love on nature. So a community that lives fully uh, according to its nature is can still be the playground of grace. And so that's why the quest in community is important. And I think that's what MacIntyre, MacIntyre is accused of. He did not like being called a virtue ethicist because that implied that he believed it was a sufficient ethic, and he didn't. Uh, the If you read him carefully, whom he most resembles is a thinker like Clement of Alexandria. The the philosophical life is a preparation for the gospel. Aristotle discovers in his reflections on the nature of happiness that what we long for would be the happiness proper only to a God. And therefore, at the end of the day, the Aristotelian quest ends in an aporia, it ends in a tragedy. I desire something that I can't have. That would be the life of a God. And the gospel points that, hey, in God's grace, a communion of life is possible where uh, we participate in the life of the Lord, and therefore there is a happiness that is attainable way beyond what even Aristotle could imagine or hope for, is made possible by the gospel.
Okay, so I want to, as we move to closing on this conversation, I want to look at then some of the political sensibilities around these claims. So some people will be listening to this and saying, okay, so it sounds like to adjudicate moral cases, we really need a theory of human nature and of human inclinations and human flourishing and communities of human flourishing. Sounds like we also even need a kind of metaphysics of God, the creator. Um, and then, of course, it looks like we might ultimately, to make sense of life's tragedies and the challenge of human evil, need a Christian conception of reality and supernatural grace. So
Mhm.
some people would be
We
like,
need the good news.
yeah. So some people say, okay, it sounds like we need basically high degrees of metaphysical consensus and maybe a Christian government if we're going to create common polity. But we can't avail ourselves of that kind of metaphysical consensus or religious consensus. So are we talking then about Christian retreat from the world in a Benedictine option? Are we talking about Christian, you might say, assimilation of the world? Let's just call it, Catholic integralism. Or are we talking about constructive communities that engage as minorities to be creative minorities in a pluralistic world that doesn't really understand Christianity anymore? W- how do we navigate the either fear or belief that this is a vision of reality that has no political uh, applicability in our world because there's not enough metaphysical consensus or religious consensus?
Yeah, I hear you asking actually several questions behind that. That is, it's are you asking me what is the role of the gospel in relation to our citizenship in this world? That's something that Augustine struggled with throughout the City of God. In Book 19, he describes us. He describes the church as the pilgrim church, as the pilgrim city of God in this life. We live in this world, but we are citizens of heaven. So, and we have natural obligations to the larger society, and we live among those who are not who don't embrace the gospel. So how are we to live in this world? And there's not one unique answer to that. If you look, for example, at someone like Gregory the Great, who is, I think, he just straddles history. There's a reason he's called great. He as a child, he has to flee Rome. They go to the family takes them. I think he was 5 years old, take them to their properties in Sicily. They come back, and what does this Roman family decide? One of the oldest of the plebeian families that had become uh, part of the aristocracy. They decide they're going to live as monks in the world. They live on their estates over in the Chalian Hill there, and of course that doesn't they can't do it. the needs of Rome are such that Gregory is kept being called back out to either help administer the city or to be an ambassador for Rome in Constantinople. And then when he's made pope, the many different ways, just in the Italian peninsula. You have the Lombards have one huge section of the Italian peninsula. You have the Greek culture and another big part. The Greek Christians have another big part of the Italian peninsula. Then you've got the missionaries in England. You have a world that has many different ways of trying to square this circle.
And just in that little optic of the life of Gregory.
And just in Gregory's life. And when you see how he responds, he doesn't have a one-size-fits-all response. And so there is no easy answer to your question. But Augustine would say that the principle always has to be that is whatever is good in this world, we can collaborate with our contemporaries because the goal is to have a world where a temporal peace is sufficient to help people to discover the true, the good, and the beautiful, and the truth of the gospel, where we want to promote communities where people can live in families and communities where the church can form the next generation by how we live, by living the corporal and spiritual works of mercy.
What
And
about philosophy?
so this is an interesting question. If you look at the two great figures to come out of the fall of Rome, the two, you could call them the last of the Romans, there's Benedict and there's Boethius. And they have an enormous influence on the West, and they have enormous influence on the English language. I mean, can you imagine it? Alfred the great Saxon king, he he commissions a translation of Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy for his court and for all the leaders, because he kind of sets up a ready reserve throughout England to protect the Saxons from invasion from the Vikings. And he uh, he thinks that the lady philosophy can help his court understand their life in the world, but then also the founding of Benedictine monasteries. So there's always been this two sides to the problem of our life in this world. There's Benedict and his uh, practices of the corporal and spiritual works of mercy in community, which became a powerhouse way beyond the walls of the monastery. The simple folk would farm around the monasteries. It was these were little satellite, little islands of Western culture around the monasteries, and then the philosophical life as a preparation for the gospel. And of course, the Constellation of Philosophy is a remarkable achievement. It's really the flowering of the Latin language. It begins with the emotion of hope, which Lady Philosophy scorns, and ends with theological hope, which the consolation of Lady Philosophy is to prepare you to embrace the gospel. And so there are different vocations in the church. There'll be people who help our contemporaries answer the questions the intellectual questions that arise from their experience in the world. The problem of innocent suffering is a philosophical problem. It may ultimately find its resolution in the mystery of the suffering Christ, but philosophical reflection helps people receive the grace of the good news. So not everyone is called to be Boethius, and not everyone's called to be Benedict, but there's some mix of the two. Um, Pope Benedict the 16th beautifully reflected on this in Deus Caritas Est, that there's the Kerygma Martyrion, so the proclamation of the gospel. There's liturgia. There's the work of the church in celebrating the sacraments, and then there's diaconia, living the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And those three things are present in every Christian life, and they are a powerhouse for our contemporaries. Uh, Christ died for the world. God so loved the world that he sent his only son. So as citizens of heaven, our vocation is to live those three elements for our contemporaries. So it's not a retreat from the world, but the world's not our permanent home either. Now, how that cashes out politically the church has got its fingers burnt by too closely associating itself to any one regime. And we've discovered, hey, the most important thing is defending the common good. And I happen to believe, along with Winston Spencer Churchill, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. 20th century experience has shown that a well-educated populace uh, knows how to protect its interests better than a disordered elite, and I think that's still the best hope. But that's my judgment. What's most important is the common good, and any regime that promotes the true common good of peace and true human flourishing has a right to claim itself as a legitimate government.
Fantastic. So, last question for those who are not yet initiated into Thomistic moral theology and would just like a few references, books, things to read, places to start, either in Aquinas or people writing about Aquinas or other ambient moral topics. What are two or three resources you'd recommend?
Well, I mean, my one of my mentors was Serve Pinckaers, and his book, the Sources of Christian Ethics, remains a wonderful way to look at the history of moral theology and the call to renew the study of moral theology. And he wrote a little teeny précis to that in Morality, the Catholic View, which I think is a good way to start. The little books of Joseph Pieper still, I think, are very helpful just to put into someone's hand because he is such a careful philosophical thinker. uh, so Pieper, Joseph Pieper, uh, Father Pinckaers. Uh, there are numerous other books that one could mention, but those two authors I keep coming back to.
Father Michael Sherwin, thank you so much for being with us today to navigate the challenge of what you have so eloquently designated a Nietzschean wasteland and uh, s- sort of invited us to counter with a quest for human flourishing based on many great figures of the past who you have articulated to us today, their vision, their texts, their relationships in so learned a way. So thank you, and thanks to all our listeners for joining us for this episode of Angelicum Conversations. We hope you'll continue to follow our series as we explore great themes and questions of philosophy and theology and the life of the church.
Thank you very much.